as I said, as the Union Army begins to make incursions into Virginia, slaves begin running away to Union lines. The process of the internal disintegration of slavery begins. It's very small at this point, because the Union Army is not around most parts of the South. Whatever the Lincoln administration says, the slaves understand that the presence of another army alters the balance of power on the ground in the South, right? Previously, the balance of power was completely on the side of the slave owners. Now there's another army. Even though it's not an emancipating army, it's not an army of abolitionists, it's not on the side of their owners. And so slaves begin to try to find refuge with the Union Army. At the very, very beginning of the war, some generals, they return these slaves, but they don't want them around. What do you want all these slaves around your army camp? What are they going to do? They're in the way. But very quickly that falls apart, partly because soldiers don't want to do that. Governor Andrew of Massachusetts says, we do not send our men into the South as slave catchers. They do not want to start rounding up fugitive slaves and giving them back to rebel owners. This becomes a policy, wait a minute, early on, thanks to General Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts. Butler, this shows you how the Civil War completely upends previous political alignments. Butler was a conservative Democrat. Butler, in the 1860 election in Massachusetts, voted for John C. Breckinridge, the pro-slavery Southern Democratic candidate. Butler is not an abolitionist. Butler is put in command at Fortress Monroe, which is in Norfolk, Virginia. It's in the control of the Union Army from the beginning of the war. In May, some slaves begin turning up. Just a couple of slaves turn up at Butler's place, Butler's fort. And they said, well, what are you guys doing here? Butler says, well, basically they said, we're going to be sent down to Carolina, not sure whether north or south, to work for the Confederate Army, and we don't want to do this, so we're running away to find refuge at Fortress Monroe. Butler says, all right, you can stick around. The next day, the local Confederate commander turns up and says, these are my slaves, and I want them back. And by the way, don't you abide by the fugitive slave law? Butler says, I'll tell you what, the fugitive slave law is a law of the United States of America. If you pledge allegiance to the United States of America, I will give you back your slaves. But the Confederate general says, no, I can't do that, so he goes away. Well, Butler says, I am keeping these guys as, quote unquote, contraband of war. Contraband. This is the origin of a word you will see a lot in literature on the Civil War, the contrabands. This is the word applied to runaway slaves who come into Union lines. Eventually there are contraband camps, there are contraband schools. The contrabands. Now, contraband is a legal term in war, but it has nothing to do with this situation. And Butler's a lawyer, he understands that, but it doesn't matter, it's a useful term. In war, legally, contraband is goods for military goods being shipped to a belligerent by a neutral party. That can be seized. In other words, if the British start shipping weaponry to the Confederacy, the Union can seize that weaponry as contraband of war, okay? That's allowed under the international laws of war. They're not supposed to seize like food or other stuff, civilian stuff, but they can seize military goods being shipped. All right, but that has nothing to do with this. This is not goods or property being shipped. Nonetheless, he says they're contraband of war. He sends a note up to Washington. Well, what do I do? Well, a few days later, he gets a message from the Secretary of War, Cameron. Your policy is approved. Passive voice, again, remember? Your policy is approved. By whom? He doesn't say. Has Lincoln approved it? Did Cameron approve it? Did the cabinet approve it? It's approved. Okay, Butler can keep doing it. Butler says, all right, anyone who wants to come here is welcome. Suddenly, Fortress Monroe becomes what slaves call the Freedom Fort. Dozens, then hundreds of slaves from surrounding areas begin to find refuge at the fort. And wait, I want to show you a picture here. Let me see if we can find it. Oh, here we go. Hold on. This is a, here we go, so-called stampede of slaves. This is not Fortress Monroe, but it's a similar thing. Actually, it is Fortress Monroe, heading toward Fortress Monroe. This is from Harper's Weekly. It's a little fanciful, but you see all these slaves heading toward Fortress Monroe. And by the way, it started out with 2 slaves who were going to be used for military purposes, but suddenly it's women and children and elderly people and people who have no connection to the war, but Butler gives them all refuge, and he starts putting them to work, laboring for the army. And he says, I'm going to pay them wages. They're not free, really. I don't know what they are, quite honestly. Nobody knows what they are, but I'm not going to send them back into slavery. And by 1862, this process is, everywhere the Union Army goes, this process is underway. Here's a wonderful photograph from 1862 of fugitive slaves crossing the Rappahannock River in Virginia heading for Union lines. But if you look, it's an old photograph, but if you see, it's a family with in a wagon. You can't really see, but there are women and children, and there's a guy on the side, and they're just coming into Union lines. This happens all over the South as the war goes on. The result of this is 2 things. One, this is the end of the Underground Railroad. Before the Civil War, the Underground Railroad, often much exaggerated, but still had helped some number, no one knows how many, of slaves get out of the South into the North and Canada. Now, they don't have to go to the North. They don't have to go to Canada, a long way away. They just go to Union lines, and that's a lot easier. And so the numbers, far more slaves escape to Union lines than ever reached Canada before the Civil War. And secondly, these actions put the slavery issue on the national agenda. The government has to start making policy about slaves. The Confiscation Act is the first policy. The second comes in August 1861 when General John C. Fremont, who has been sent to take control of Missouri. Fremont is a very dashing character, good-looking guy, had a beautiful wife, Jessie Benton Fremont. He had been the Republican candidate in 1856. Only one problem, he was a totally lousy general. And he couldn't get Missouri under control at all. And so at the end of August, he issues a famous proclamation freeing all the slaves of Missouri. It also says that any civilian found bearing arms against the government will be shot forthwith, which is not proper procedure either. But freeing all the slaves in Missouri. Well, Lincoln asks Fremont to modify the order to bring it into compliance with the Confiscation Act. Confiscation Act frees slaves used for military purposes. You can do that, but you can't go beyond what Congress has done. Fremont refuses to modify it, and Lincoln then, as commander-in-chief, overturns the order or redoes it in tune with the Confiscation Act and also gets rid of the thing to shoot civilians. This actually, Lincoln probably receives more negative mail. You can go through Lincoln's mail in the Lincoln's papers in the Library of Congress. He probably received more negative correspondence about modifying Fremont's order than at any other point in his presidency from Republicans. Fremont's order had kind of galvanized Republican sentiment. Nothing had happened in the war for months except one loss. Now suddenly someone is trying to do something. And if it requires freeing those slaves, let them do it to keep Missouri under control. Lincoln says, if I let this stand, it will alienate Kentucky. Kentucky is, remember, this is just the moment Kentucky is shifting toward pro-union stance. Lincoln says, they would not go with us unless I modified that. Kentucky would not budge until that proclamation was modified. But this now unleashes the slavery issue. This is when, in the Janap book, a speech by Frederick Douglass about this. The abolitionists now, who have been fairly quiet, launch a campaign for emancipation to become part of the war effort. Finally, in another controversy, it takes place in November, where Secretary of War Simon Cameron issues a call in his annual report for arming black soldiers. Remember, at this point, the Army is all white. Black soldiers are not allowed in the Union Army. We'll talk about this next week. Cameron, without consulting Lincoln, calls for the arming of black soldiers. Lincoln is furious and, literally speaking, sends him off to Siberia. He makes him ambassador to Russia, kicks him out, and brings in a much better Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who for the rest of the war. Now, by the way, why was Cameron, who was known to be sort of incompetent, Secretary of War? The reason was, at the Chicago Republican Convention in 1860, Lincoln's managers, he wasn't there, had promised Pennsylvania a cabinet post for Cameron. He was the leader of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, if they swung their votes to Lincoln. And Lincoln felt, even though he had nothing to do with it, obliged to honor this and put Cameron in the cabinet. The fact that he made him Secretary of War shows he wasn't expecting a war, because Cameron was mostly known for corruption. In fact, Lincoln, Lincoln's a funny guy, and we'll see that, but he asked Thaddeus Stevens, what do you think, what do you know about Cameron? I hear he's corrupt. And Stevens said, well, I'll tell you this, he would not steal a red-hot stove. Lincoln thought that was pretty funny. And so the next time he saw Cameron, he said, you know what Thaddeus Stevens said of you? He said you wouldn't steal a red-hot stove. Cameron got very indignant. He said, that's outrageous, say that. So the next time Lincoln saw Thaddeus Stevens, he said, Cameron objects to what you said about him, about the red-hot stove. And Stevens said, all right, I was wrong. He would steal a red-hot stove.